All right, deep divers, welcome back. We're tackling a really interesting question today, one that's been generating a lot of buzz lately. You want to know if this whole idea of transracial identity, or RCTA, it has any implications for traditions like Black History Month and reparations,
Mm.
especially as it becomes, more widespread.
Yeah, it's a really, really thought-provoking question
Yeah.
because you're essentially asking, how individual identity could impact these traditions that are so deeply rooted in shared history and collective
Yeah,
experiences.
exactly. And honestly, it feels like we're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
To help us navigate all this, we've got a few sources lined up for a deep dive today. A couple of Wikipedia articles, a TikTok video that presents a very specific perspective, and even a Reddit thread that got pretty heated discussing Michael Jackson's racial identity. I'm really curious to see where this all takes us.
Well, to even begin unpacking this, I think we need a solid understanding of ethnicity itself. You know what I mean? The Wikipedia article on ethnicity defines it as a mix of cultural heritage, ancestry, history, language, and even physical traits. It's not just one thing, it's this whole tapestry of influences.
Oh, totally. It's like a recipe with a ton of ingredients, and each one adds something unique to the final dish.
Yeah.
So where does transracial identity fit into all of that? It's not as simple as just swapping out one ingredient for another, is it?
Right, and that's where things get really complex. Wikipedia also points out that ethnicity can be both inherited and socially constructed, meaning it's not fixed, it's not unchanging.
Hmm.
People can shift between ethnic groups over time through processes like assimilation, and it even quotes an anthropologist, Ronald Cohen, who said that sometimes the labels we put on people don't actually match how they see themselves.
Now, that's interesting. That makes me think about how sometimes people are labeled one way based on their appearance, but they might feel a deeper connection to a different culture. It kind of brings us closer to your question.
Hmm.
Is transracial identity a genuine expression of belonging to that culture? Or is it an oversimplification that ignores the complexities of heritage and ancestry?
Hmm. It really raises those questions about agency and authenticity. Whose perspective matters more,
Mm.
the individual's or the collective understanding of what it means to belong to a particular group?
Right, that's such a great point. And it leads us to this TikTok video we found, where the creator argues that race is tied to physical traits. Seems straightforward enough, but how does that align with the more fluid and complex understanding of ethnicity we've been discussing?
Well, it's interesting because the TikTok creator focuses heavily on biological features, while the anthropological view emphasizes a much broader cultural and historical context.
It's almost like comparing apples and oranges, isn't it?
Yes, in a way. And it's crucial to remember that focusing solely on the biological aspect of race can oversimplify things. We can't ignore those social and political forces that shape how we understand race and identity. In fact, the Wikipedia article mentions sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winant, who criticized applying assimilation models to non-white communities. They argued that doing so ignores how race plays a huge role in social and political structures.
So it's not just about how an individual feels,
Yeah.
it's about recognizing that broader context. You can't just erase history and the power dynamics that come with it.
Right, exactly. And that brings us to a real life example that I think highlights the tension between personal identity and how society perceives race, particularly within the Black community. This Reddit thread about Michael Jackson's changing appearance.
Oh yeah, this one got intense. Some fans were absolutely adamant that he was a proud Black man, quoting his own words, while others seemed really uncomfortable even discussing it. There were definitely some very strong feelings about race and identity there. Does this show how personal identity can clash with those societal perceptions?
It definitely does. It highlights how sensitive this topic is, especially the perception of Michael Jackson's transformation as a rejection of Blackness. Some fans, even with the explanation of vitiligo, struggle to reconcile his changes with their understanding of what it means to be Black. It makes you think, can someone who changes their appearance to resemble another race genuinely claim belonging to their original racial group?
Hmm, it seems like such a gray area, doesn't it? And this complexity feeds into your initial question about the potential impact of transracial identity on things like Black History Month and reparations. These concepts, as outlined in the Wikipedia article on race, are deeply rooted in the historical experiences of Black people. If transracial identification becomes more common, could it change the meaning of these traditions? Almost like adding a new ingredient to that ethnicity recipe, and we're not sure how it'll affect the taste.
The potential for change is certainly there. Think about it. Black History Month and reparations are built on a shared history, a collective experience of oppression. But if individuals can move in and out of racial categories, it blurs the lines of that shared history.
That's an interesting point. It reminds me of how the Wikipedia article talked about Brazil as an example of how racial categories can be more fluid. based more on appearance than strict ancestry.
Mhm.
I imagine navigating something like Black History Month in a system like that will be much different.
Exactly. And if we apply that kind of fluidity to the context of Black History Month or reparations in the US, it does raise some really complicated questions. Who's included? Who's excluded? How do you even define the shared experiences that these concepts are based on if the lines are constantly shifting?
Yeah, it's almost like the foundation of these traditions starts to get a little shaky. And this brings me back to a pretty powerful quote from that Wikipedia entry. The concept of race masking the overwhelming genetic similarity of all peoples and the mosaic patterns of variation is not only socially dysfunctional, but is biologically indefensible. With science so clearly against the idea of distinct biological races, does transracial identity even make sense from a scientific perspective?
It's a critical question, especially given the scientific evidence. We know that race is a social construct, not a biological reality. The Wikipedia article explains the concept of gene flow, which basically means human populations have always mixed and mingled. The idea of separate, pure races just doesn't hold up scientifically.
So if there's no biological basis for distinct races, what does it mean to identify as transracial? What are we really talking about when we use that term?
It challenges us to think about identity in a whole new way. Beyond the traditional frameworks of race and biology, are we focusing too much on the physical when the roots of identity might lie in something deeper, something more experiential and cultural?
It's like we've been looking at the wrong ingredients in that ethnicity recipe all along. But that's a conversation for another deep dive, maybe over a cup of coffee.
Perhaps with a slice of that Brazilian carrot cake you're always raving about?
Now you're speaking my language. But before we get sidetracked by deliciousness, let's take a pause here and reflect on what we've uncovered so far in part one of our deep dive.
It's fascinating, isn't it? We started by trying to understand how transracial identity, or RCTA, could affect traditions like Black History Month and reparations. And now we're questioning the very idea of race itself. It's like this deep dive has taken us down this rabbit hole of identity and belonging.
It really has. And I think that quote from the Wikipedia article about race being socially dysfunctional and biologically indefensible really sticks with me. If race is truly a social construct, can we just dismantle it like that? Poof, it's gone.
Unfortunately, it's not that simple. While science has, debunked the idea of distinct biological races, the social and political impacts of racial categories are very real and have been for centuries. We're talking about systemic racism, discrimination, prejudice. Those things don't just disappear overnight, even if we acknowledge that race is a social construct.
It's like trying to renovate a house but realizing the foundation is crumbling. You can put up new walls and a fresh coat of paint, but the underlying problems remain.
That's a great analogy. And that's why these conversations about Black History Month and reparations are so important. They force us to acknowledge that history, the very real consequences of racial categorization, and work towards a more just future.
But that's where the concept of transracial identity comes in and really throws a wrench in things.
If someone can choose to identify as Black, even if they don't share that same history of oppression, does that diminish the significance of Black History Month or the arguments for reparations?
It's a valid concern, and it's sparked a lot of debate. Some people argue that transracial identity undermines the foundation of these traditions, while others see it as an individual expression of belonging that shouldn't negate the struggles of the Black community.
It reminds me of those heated conversations we saw in that Reddit thread about Michael Jackson. Some fans fiercely defended his Black identity, while others questioned whether his transformation was authentic. These discussions about race and identity often get very personal and emotional. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's why approaching these conversations with sensitivity and a willingness to listen to different perspectives is so important. There are no easy answers here, and shutting down dialogue only leads to more misunderstanding and division.
It's like we're all trying to navigate this uncharted territory of identity, and we're bound to bump into each other along the way. But maybe those bumps can be opportunities for growth and understanding.
I completely agree. It's about challenging our own assumptions, being open to new perspectives, and recognizing that these issues are incredibly complex. After all, identity is a journey, not a destination.
Speaking of journeys, this deep dive has taken us on quite a ride. We started by defining ethnicity, then questioned the concept of race, and now we're grappling with how transracial identity could impact traditions like Black History Month and reparations. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And while we may not have clear-cut answers, I think we've uncovered some valuable insights along the way. We've seen how fluid and multi-layered ethnicity can be, how social constructs have real-world consequences, and how personal identity intersects with these bigger societal narratives in really complex ways.
It's like we've peeled back the layers of that ethnicity recipe and found a whole new world of flavors and textures.
Exactly. And as we continue to explore these complexities, it's important to remember that the conversation is ongoing. New discoveries are being made, perspectives are evolving, and our understanding of identity is constantly being reshaped.
And speaking of continuing the conversation, I think it's time to dive into the next part of our exploration. We'll be delving even deeper into the intersection of identity, science, and culture.
We'll explore the role of genetics in understanding human diversity, examine the historical context of those racial categories we've been talking about, and consider the ethical implications of transracial identification. It's going to be a challenging but enlightening journey.
So buckle up, deep divers, because we're not done yet. As we wrap up this exploration, I keep coming back to this paradox we've been circling.
Yeah.
We're told race is a social construct with no basis in biology. But yet we have traditions like Black History Month and these whole conversations about reparations that are rooted in the lived experiences of people who've been, categorized and treated differently because of race.
Yeah, it's this powerful tension, and it gets to the heart of why this topic is so complex and even uncomfortable for some people. We can't just erase history, even as we try to move past these outdated and often harmful categories.
It's like we're living in this house that's built on shaky ground. We got to figure out how to make it safe, but we also can't ignore those foundational flaws. It's messy, to say the least.
It really is a very apt analogy, though, and it gets even more intricate when we think about your initial question about transracial identity and how it impacts these traditions. If race is truly fluid, like some argue, what happens to those traditions that are rooted in specific historical experiences of racial categorization and oppression?
Right? It makes me think about that example of Brazil we talked about from the Wikipedia article, where they have dozens of racial categories based largely on appearance. Would something like Black History Month even be possible in a system like that? Would it become so fragmented that it loses its meaning?
That's a fascinating question. Black History Month, as we know it, honors the shared experiences of Black people, a group that has historically faced systemic discrimination based on their race. If we start blurring those lines of racial categorization, it raises questions about how we define and commemorate those experiences.
And what about the whole discussion of reparations? That's a concept so deeply tied to addressing historical injustices suffered by a specific group because of their race. If someone can move in and out of that group, how does that affect the arguments for reparations?
It adds this layer of nuance that's really hard to untangle. Reparations are about rectifying past wrongs, acknowledging that those wrongs have a lasting impact. If we accept this idea of transracial identity, it raises the question, who is eligible for those reparations? And how do we measure the harm done to individuals when the very concept of race itself is shifting?
It feels like this idea of transracial identity really challenges some of our most fundamental beliefs about race and identity. It's like we're being asked to completely rebuild that house, not just fix the foundation.
And that's why this conversation is so crucial. It forces us to re-examine these deeply ingrained beliefs, to grapple with the complexities of identity in a world that's constantly changing.
But it's not just a philosophical debate, is it? These conversations have real-world implications for how we understand history, how we address inequality, and how we build a more just and inclusive society.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to approach these conversations thoughtfully with empathy and a willingness to learn from each other. Ultimately, we're all just trying to figure out how to navigate this complex terrain of identity and belonging together.
Well said. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this intricate topic, but hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listeners, some new food for thought. We've explored the nuances of ethnicity, the social construction of race, and the potential impact of transracial identity on traditions like Black History Month and reparations.
And as you continue to ponder these complexities, we'll leave you with one final thought-provoking question. What if genome editing technology allowed individuals to physically change their traits to align with their chosen racial identity? Would that make transracial identification more legitimate? Or would it further blur the lines between biology identity and social constructs, creating even more complex ethical and societal questions?
It's a question with no easy answers, but one that deserves careful consideration. So keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and join us again next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of ideas.